The bowl of noodles sat on the wooden pass-through, a small island of steam in the raucous sea of the Redemption Gulch saloon. From her cramped kitchen, May could see the men at the tables, their faces ruddy with sun and whiskey, their voices a low thunder of boasts and complaints. For an hour the noodles had waited. The broth, once shimmering with savory promise, was now filming over. The slivers of cooked chicken were sinking, and the fresh scallions she'd carefully sprinkled on top were starting to wilt. This was the third night she'd made a dish from her home, and the third night it had gone untouched. Jedediah Thorne, the saloon's owner, had called it an experiment. "Give the men something different," he'd said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "A novelty." But the miners and ranch hands of Redemption Gulch, Nevada, did not want novelty. They wanted tough steak, stale bread, and potatoes boiled into submission. They wanted food that tasted like the dirt they worked in all day. They did not want the delicate, clean flavors of a world they couldn't imagine and didn't care to. May was a ghost in this place. A 25-year-old widow, bound by a debt her husband had left behind when his lungs gave out on the railroad grade. Thorne had taken her on as a cook, a position that sounded like a mercy but felt like a cage. She moved silently between the stove and the chopping block, a slight figure in a plain gray Cheong Sam, the high collar a stark contrast to the grime of the kitchen. The men saw her, but they didn't. She was a fixture, like the tarnished mirror behind the bar or the permanent stain on the floor where a man had bled out last winter. They ignored her, and they ignored her food. Her presence was a quiet, constant reminder of the Chinese crews that had laid the tracks to this God-forsaken town and then been run out when the work was done. She reached for the bowl, her fingers tracing the rim. It was a waste of good ingredients. Ingredients she'd bartered for with the freight driver, trading him packets of her special tea for a few precious vegetables. She would eat the noodles herself, cold, after the saloon closed and the last drunk had been pushed out into the dusty street. It was a familiar ritual of disappointment. However, just as her hand closed around the bowl, the saloon doors swung open, admitting a slice of the blistering late summer sun, and a man who seemed to wear the trail itself. He was not large, but he moved with a stillness that drew the eye. His hat was battered, his clothes coated in a fine red dust, but his boots were well kept. He walked past the boisterous card game and bypassed the bar, his gaze sweeping the room with a calm, assessing quality that was unusual. The other men drank to forget the day. This one looked like he was committing it to memory. His eyes, the color of faded denim, settled on the pass-through. They settled on the bowl of noodles. He stopped, his back to the rest of the room. May froze, her hand still on the bowl. He was looking at the food. Not through it, not past it, but at it. He turned his head slightly, not towards the barman, but towards the small, shadowed opening of her kitchen. "Is that for anyone?" he asked. His voice was low and carried a dry rasp, the sound of too much dust and not enough water. The noise in the saloon seemed to dip, a momentary lull as a few men noticed the strange interaction. Thorne, who had been polishing a glass at the end of the bar, straightened up. "Just the cook's own meal, friend," Thorne called out, his tone slick and dismissive. "I've got beefsteak. Gritty, but it fills the gut." The stranger didn't look at Thorne. His eyes remained on the kitchen opening, on the sliver of May's face visible in the shadows. "Looks better than beefsteak," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He took a step closer to the pass-through. "I'll have that." A chuckle rippled through a nearby table. "Careful there, mister," one of the miners jeered. "You don't know what's in that." May felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up her neck. She wanted to snatch the bowl away, to hide it and herself. But the stranger's gaze held her. It wasn't pitying or curious. It was simple, direct, and serious, as if he were conducting a business transaction of great importance. Thorne set the glass down with a sharp click. "The man wants steak," he announced, overriding the stranger's request. "My patrons prefer American food." The stranger finally turned to face Thorne. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I am an American," he said, the words falling into the sudden quiet. "And I ask for the noodles." He placed a silver dollar on the counter of the pass-through. The coin shone bright and clean against the dark, greasy wood. "That cover it?" he asked, his eyes back on May. May looked from the coin to the man's face, then to Thorne, whose jaw was tight with irritation. No one had ever directly challenged Thorne in his own establishment over something so trivial. But it wasn't trivial. It was a line being drawn in the dust, and she was standing on one side of it. For the first time in months, someone was waiting for her to make a choice. With a small, trembling breath, she slid the bowl of noodles across the counter. The man, who the town would come to know as Arthur Bishop, picked up the bowl. He ignored the stares and the murmurs that followed him as he took a seat at a small, empty table in the corner, his back to the wall. He picked up the chopsticks she had placed beside the bowl, his movements surprisingly deft. The saloon watched, a jury of grim-faced men, as he lifted the first strands of noodles to his lips. He chewed slowly, deliberately. A long moment passed. Then he took another bite, and another. He ate the entire bowl, down to the last drop of broth, his focus absolute. When he was finished, he set the bowl down, placed the chopsticks neatly across the top, and met May's gaze through the pass-through. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a gesture of charity. It was a gesture of respect. That single nod was like a stone dropped into a still, murky pond. The next night, a grizzled old prospector, emboldened by Arthur's precedent, shyly asked if he could try some of that Chinese soup. May's hands shook as she prepared it, but this time the bowl didn't sit waiting. It was consumed with a surprising grunt of satisfaction. The night after that, 2 cattle drivers, tired of their own trail cooking, ordered a plate of the dumplings she'd been hesitant to even make. A strange shift was occurring. Arthur Bishop had become a quiet fixture at his corner table, ordering a different dish from her every evening. He never said much, but his presence was a shield. The other men, seeing that a man as steady and self-possessed as Arthur enjoyed the food, began to let their curiosity outweigh their prejudice. The orders for her cooking started as a trickle, then became a steady stream. The scent of ginger and star anise began to mingle with the stale odors of beer and unwashed bodies. For the first time, May had to buy ingredients in bulk. Jedediah Thorne watched this transformation with a curdled expression. He was making more money, but the saloon was no longer entirely his. The center of gravity was shifting from his bar to her kitchen. The men still drank his whiskey, but now they talked about her food. He started making small, cutting remarks, loud enough for her to hear. "Don't get used to it," he'd mutter as he passed the kitchen. "Fads die out." One afternoon, the freight wagon was late, and May found herself without the chicken she needed for the evening's most requested dish. Panic tightened her chest. To fail now, when she was just gaining a foothold, felt like a catastrophe. She saw Thorne speaking with the wagon driver when he finally arrived, a tense, low conversation. When the driver approached her, his face was apologetic. "Sorry, ma'am," he mumbled, not meeting her eye. "Mr. Thorne bought up all the poultry. Said he had a special event." There was no special event. May knew it. She looked over at Thorne, who was watching her, a smug little smile playing on his lips. He was trying to break her momentum, to starve her of supplies and force the men back to his greasy steak. It was a petty, cruel display of power. Her heart sank. She had nothing to offer tonight but plain rice and broth. The men would be disappointed, their fragile trust broken. Just as despair began to settle in, Arthur Bishop walked in, earlier than usual. He took one look at her face, visible through the pass-through, and seemed to understand immediately. He walked to the bar where Thorne was preening. "Jedediah," Arthur said, his voice even, "I hear you've cornered the market on chicken." Thorne puffed out his chest. "A man's got to provide for his customers' needs." "Funny," Arthur replied, his gaze unwavering. "Seems to me you're providing for your own. Those men aren't here for your steak anymore. They're here for hers." He gestured with his head toward the kitchen. "You're a businessman, Thorne. This isn't good business." "I decide what's good business in my saloon," Thorne snapped, his politeness finally cracking. "Do you?" Arthur asked softly. He then turned to face the dozen or so men who had started to drift in for their evening meal. "Boys," he called out, his voice cutting through the room, "Mr. Thorne here has decided you'll be eating steak tonight. He's bought all the chicken for himself." A collective groan went through the room. One man, a burly smithy named Peterson, slammed his hand on a table. "To hell he has! I was looking forward to them noodles." "Me too," another chimed in. "I'm sick of steak." Thorne's face went from pale to florid. He was being challenged in front of everyone, his authority publicly questioned. He looked from the angry faces of his patrons to Arthur's calm, implacable stare. He had miscalculated badly, assuming the men's loyalty was to him and not to their own appetites. Defeated, he spat on the floor. "Fine," he snarled. "Take the damn birds." He stalked into the back storeroom, and a moment later the crate of chickens appeared on the floor by the kitchen door. May watched, her heart pounding. Arthur hadn't raised a hand. He hadn't uttered a single threat. He had simply held a mirror up to Thorne, and the entire saloon had seen the man's ugly reflection. He had given her a voice by making the men her allies. But as she looked at Thorne's retreating back, she saw a look of pure venom directed not at Arthur, but at her. The surface conflict was resolved. But she did not yet know that the battle for the chickens was only the beginning, and Thorne's spite ran deeper than any simple business rivalry. What she had mistaken for employment was, in fact, a form of bondage, and the papers she had signed were not a contract, but a chain. That night, long after the last satisfied customer had left and the saloon was dark and quiet, May was scrubbing the great iron stove, her arms aching. The smell of bleach and old grease filled the small kitchen. The victory over the chickens felt hollow now, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Thorne had been too quiet for the rest of the night, a silence that felt more menacing than his anger. A soft knock came from the kitchen's back door, the one that led to the alley. May startled, her hand clutching the scrub brush like a weapon. "Who is it?" she whispered. "It's Arthur Bishop," came the low voice. "May I have a word?" She hesitated. It was improper for a man to call on a widow, especially at this hour, but he had been her only defender. Unlatching the door, she opened it just a crack. He stood in the moonlight, his hat in his hands. He wasn't looking at her with desire or pity, but with the same serious consideration he'd shown that first day. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, "but I saw Thorne's face earlier. He's not a man who forgives a public slight. I'm worried for you." "He will find another way," May said, her voice barely audible. It was a statement of fact. "He has some kind of hold on you, doesn't he? More than just your wages." It wasn't a question so much as a confirmation. May's gaze dropped to the worn floorboards. To admit the truth felt like another humiliation, another surrender. But the quiet strength in Arthur's posture gave her a sliver of courage. She nodded. "My husband," she began, the English words feeling clumsy in her mouth. "He was sick, from the railroad work. Mr. Thorne gave us money for the doctor." "A loan," Arthur said. "Yes. When he passed, I had no money. Mr. Thorne said I would work to pay. He had me sign a paper." A cold stillness settled over Arthur. "This paper. Do you have it?" She went to a small, loose floorboard beneath her cot in the tiny adjoining room. From the hollow space she retrieved a folded, yellowed document and a small, leather-bound ledger. It was her husband's, filled with columns of Chinese characters she couldn't read. She could only speak her dialect. Literacy was a luxury her village couldn't afford. She handed the paper to Arthur. He unfolded it carefully under the dim light of her single lantern. His brow furrowed as he read. The silence stretched on, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the alley. "May," he said at last, his voice tight with a controlled anger she had not heard before. "Can you read English?" She shook her head. "A little. Not words like these." "This isn't a simple work agreement," he said, his voice low and grim. "He didn't just give you a job to pay off a loan. According to this, you are his indentured servant. The debt accrues interest, compounded monthly, at a rate that's illegal in any organized territory. You can't leave. You can't work for anyone else. Based on these terms, you'll never be free. You'll owe him for the rest of your life." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had known it was bad, but she had not understood the totality of it. She had believed that with hard work she could earn her way out. Now she saw the truth. The hole was bottomless. Thorne hadn't offered her a job. He had bought her. "And this ledger," Arthur continued, picking up the small book. He opened it, his eyes scanning the columns of elegant characters. "What is this?" "My husband's," she said. "He kept accounts for his work crew." Arthur's expression changed. A flicker of something, recognition, understanding, crossed his face. He pointed to a recurring character next to a series of dates and sums. "What does this symbol mean?" "It means Thorne," she said. "It was my husband's way of writing his name." Arthur was silent for a long moment, tracing the characters with his finger. "May," he said slowly, "your husband wasn't just a laborer. He was meticulous. These aren't just his own accounts. He was tracking payments. Payments from Thorne to the crew foreman. And according to these dates, the amounts Thorne was giving the foreman were less than the amounts the railroad was paying Thorne to distribute." He looked up at her, his eyes dark with the implication. Thorne wasn't just a saloon owner. He was a payroll contractor for the Chinese crews, and he was skimming from them all. The secret was out, larger and uglier than her own private debt. Her husband hadn't just left her in bondage. He had left her the evidence of Thorne's much greater crime. This ledger was the reason Thorne had been so quick to trap her after her husband's death. It wasn't about the small loan. It was about silencing the one person who might possess the proof of his fraud. A heavy boot scraped on the boardwalk out front, followed by a loud, authoritative banging on the saloon's main doors. "May, open up! Thorne wants this place cleared out. Now!" It was the voice of Marcus Heller, the brutish town constable who served as Thorne's personal enforcer more than a keeper of the peace. Panic seized May. They were coming for her. "He knows," she whispered, looking at the ledger in Arthur's hands. "He suspects," Arthur corrected, his mind working quickly. He folded the contract and tucked it into his own pocket, then handed the ledger back to her. "Hide this. Not under the floorboards. Somewhere better." May's eyes darted around the tiny room. She lifted the lid of a large sack of rice, plunged the ledger deep into the dry grains, and smoothed the top over. The banging came again, louder this time. "I mean it, woman. Get out." Arthur put a hand on her arm. "You don't have to run," he said, his voice a steady anchor in her terror. "He has a piece of paper. But you have the truth, and now you have a witness." He looked her directly in the eye. "What do you want to do?" It was the most terrifying question she had ever been asked. For months she had survived by being invisible, by not making waves. But that was a slow death. Running was a fast one. Standing her ground, that was something else entirely. She thought of the men enjoying her food, of Arthur's quiet nod of respect, of the feel of an honest coin in her hand. It was a taste of a life she now refused to surrender. She lifted her chin. "I stay," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is my kitchen." Before Arthur could respond, the back door burst open. Thorne stood there, flanked by Heller, whose hand rested on the butt of his pistol. Thorne's face was a mask of triumphant rage. "Your kitchen?" Thorne sneered. "You own nothing. You are nothing but an asset on my books. Heller, she's trespassing. Remove her." Heller took a step forward, his meaty hand reaching for May, but Arthur moved to stand between them. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood there, a calm and immovable object. "You'll not touch her, Marcus," Arthur said. Heller laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "And who are you to stop me, drifter? Get out of the way before you get hurt." "I'm a man who knows what a fraudulent contract looks like," Arthur said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "And I'm a man who can read a ledger. The U.S. Marshal is due in Redemption Gulch on the Weekly Express. I imagine he'd be very interested to hear about a saloon owner who's been defrauding the Central Pacific Railroad and keeping a woman in illegal servitude." Thorne's face went white. The mention of the railroad, of a U.S. Marshal, struck a nerve far deeper than any threat of physical violence. It was a threat to his entire crooked empire. "You're bluffing," Thorne hissed, but the sweat on his brow told a different story. "There's no proof." "Her husband's ledger says otherwise," Arthur countered, "and I have your contract right here in my pocket. I wonder what a federal judge would make of it." For a moment, no one moved. The kitchen was a tinderbox of hate, fear, and defiance. Thorne looked from Arthur's unyielding face to May's terrified but resolute one. He had lost control. His power, built on intimidation and deceit, was dissolving in the light of a single damning truth. He had to make a choice: escalate to violence and risk federal prison, or retreat. With a guttural roar of frustration, Thorne turned. "This isn't over," he spat, his words aimed at May. He jabbed a finger at her. "This town'll never accept you." He and Heller stormed out, slamming the door behind them, leaving a trembling silence in their wake. May leaned against the stove, her legs threatening to give out. She had stood her ground. She had won. But as Thorne's threat echoed in the small room, she knew the fight had just begun. She had an ally, and she had the truth. But she was still a lone Chinese widow in a town that had only just learned her name. 4 months later, the blistering heat of summer had given way to the crisp, golden light of a Nevada autumn. On a small lot just off the main street, a new clapboard building stood, modest but immaculate. A simple, hand-painted sign swung gently in the breeze. May's Noodle House. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the rich aroma of simmering broth and savory spices. Every one of the 6 tables was full. Miners, ranchers, and townsfolk sat elbow to elbow, their heads bent over steaming bowls. The low murmur of conversation was punctuated by the satisfying click of chopsticks. At the front counter, taking coin and making change, stood Arthur Bishop. He wore a clean shirt and a canvas apron. The lines of the trail softened from his face. May moved through the small, efficient kitchen, a space she had designed herself. A clean white apron was tied over her gray cheongsam. Her movements were no longer silent and furtive, but confident and precise. She was not a ghost here. She was the heart of the enterprise. The U.S. Marshal had arrived as scheduled. Arthur, who, it turned out, had once clerked for a judge in Sacramento, presented the case with quiet, unassailable logic. The fraudulent contract was invalidated on the spot. Faced with the ledger and the threat of a federal investigation into his dealings with the railroad, Jedediah Thorne had crumbled. He sold the saloon at a loss and left town on the next eastbound train, his reputation in tatters. The Central Pacific, eager to avoid a scandal, had paid May a settlement for her husband's death and the wages Thorne had stolen, a sum that was, to her, a fortune. It was enough to buy the small lot, and with the help of the town's smithy and a few other men who had grown fond of her cooking, to build her eatery. Arthur had stayed. He'd never explained what he was drifting from, or what he'd been looking for, but he seemed to have found it in the quiet purpose of their shared work. He managed the books, fairly this time, and handled the customers, his steady presence a guarantee of order and respect. They were partners in business and in a quiet, unspoken understanding that was slowly building between them. May brought a fresh bowl of noodles from the kitchen, the steam rising to curl around her face. She placed it in front of a young ranch hand who looked up at her with a grateful smile. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. She looked around the room, at the full tables, at the faces of the people who had once ignored her. They had not just accepted her. They had made a place for her. Redemption Gulch had, in its own rough way, lived up to its name. Her gaze met Arthur's across the room, and he gave her that same slow nod he had on the very first night, a gesture of respect, a promise kept. The bowl she had just served was identical to the one that had sat cold and rejected on the saloon pass-through months ago, but everything else had changed. It was no longer a symbol of her isolation, but a testament to the fact that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to take a chance, to truly see what others refuse to change a life forever. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.